time, you remember where you were, you remember what you were doing, you remember the feelings that you had when you saw what was happening on that day. It was 3 days later, though, that there was a national service of prayer and remembrance in the National Cathedral. In that service, there was politicians and congressmen and dignitaries and foreign officials that had gathered in the National Cathedral that day. And President George W. Bush that day addressed those who were in attendance. Billy Graham got up and he shared some truth from God's word among the congregation. There were hymns that were sung. And I remember watching it that day, and I remember still today vividly, 23 years later, hearing the words of the great hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," as it echoed through the entire cathedral that day as they sang that song, because we as a nation on that day, we needed to be reminded of the truth that I want to give you today that we're going to discover in Psalm 46. And that is that God is present in our presence. If you go back and watch the words that Billy Graham offered that day in his message to the people in attendance, he shared with them, he said, God is here. God is present. As we ask the questions in our life, where are you, God? God is present. And then they sang that song that reminded people that God is present in our present. And that hymn that was written by Martin Luther 500 years ago has been sung throughout the history of the Christian church ever since. For 500 years, Christians who are facing persecution have sung that song to be reminded that God is present in their present. As martyrs of the Christian faith are facing death itself, they are reminded by the words of that song that God is present in their presence. It's a song that has been sung at funerals as believers are reminded that God is present in our present. And those words that Martin Luther wrote in that amazing hymn come from the words of Psalm 46. It's been written that Psalm 46 was Martin Luther's favorite psalm, and as he reflected on the truth of the words from Psalm 46, that he wrote down the words to that great hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And so today, I want to remind you of that great truth, that God is present in your present. Because there have been times in my life where I have asked the question, God, where are you? There was a time in which I lost my job and I wasn't sure what was going to happen, and I needed to be reminded that God is present in my present. I remember when the doctor told us that Beth had cancer, and I had to be reminded in that moment that God is present in my presence. There have been times in which I've been betrayed by friends, and I've been, people have turned their back on me, and I've had to be reminded that God is present in my presence. And I think it's a truth that we need to hear corporately today as believers, that God is present in our present. As we live in a time in which there is natural disasters and there's governmental chaos and there's pandemics and all the things that are facing us, we need to be reminded corporately that God is present in our presence. But I can almost guarantee that there's some who are sitting here today that you need to hear this personally, because there's chaos going on in your life. Your life is falling apart. And you need to be reminded today that God is present in your presence. The marriage that's hanging on by a thread, God is present. When your children are facing addictions and they're going in some direction of rebellion, God is present. When the diagnosis is received and it doesn't look promising, God is present. When maybe you're here and you're experiencing tremendous loss in your life, God is present. And that's the truth that we are going to discover from Psalm 46, that God is present in my presence, He's present in your present as well. As I said, this is a continuation of our series from the book of Psalms that I've entitled Greatest Hits, because we're looking at some of the greatest hits through the book of Psalms. And Psalms was a songbook to the ancient people of God. The ancient Israelites, they would write down these songs and they were compiled and they have been preserved for us. And these Psalms speak to every single human emotion. But even more than that, these Psalms speak to great truths that we need to understand concerning the God who loves us. And that's why our memory verse comes from Psalm chapter 51, verse 6, which reminds us, behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, and in the hidden part, you will make me know wisdom. Because, right, music is that kind of gateway to our soul. And these songs really speak to the deepest parts of who we are, not just emotionally, but to speak to us theologically as we understand the great truths and understand the wisdom of God himself. And so in the first week, we were in Psalm chapter 1, and there, as we saw that, we saw the direction of two different people, the path of the righteous and the path of the unrighteous. And I reminded you that your direction will determine your destination, that all of us are on a path, and whichever path that we choose, ultimately there is a destination there for every single one of us. It could be a destination that ends in life and blessing, or it could be a destination that ends in death and cursings, but your direction ultimately will choose your destination. Last week we looked at Psalm 23, maybe the greatest hit of all the greatest hits. And there we discovered that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And that he is our shepherd God. He cares for us, and he protects us, and he provides for us. And there, last week, I encouraged you to learn to be content in Christ. And I asked you that very pointed question. I don't know if you've been asking it yourself that question this week or not. But the question was, is Jesus enough? When you lose everything else, is Jesus enough? Which really dovetails well into what we're going to look at today in Psalm 46, which reminds us that God is present in our present. Just to give you a little bit of background as to when they believe that Psalm 46 was written, it was written in the context of the events that happened in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. In those two chapters, there was the Assyrian king Sennacherib. And Sennacherib was moving into the region of Judah, and he was taking people captive, and he was destroying cities. And he came about at about 700 BC, and he had his army encircle the city of Jerusalem. And there was about 185,000 Assyrian soldiers that had surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Assyrians were very, very brutal people. They would advertise, as you can see here, they would advertise their brutality to everyone who came into contact with them. Now, that is not a picture of somebody visiting the dentist, okay? That's what it looks like, right? But there are recordings of the Assyrians ripping limbs off of people, cutting their noses off, removing their lips, gouging out their eyeballs. And they would do this because they didn't just want to conquer a people. They actually wanted to devastate the people that they were conquering. And so they would leave these people alive as a visual reminder of the brutality of the Assyrians. And it's this army that has surrounded the city of Jerusalem when the words of Psalm 46 was written. Because God wanted to remind the people in the midst of maybe the greatest obstacle in their history is that God was present in their presence. And so we're going to pick it up here in Psalm 46, beginning in verse 1. And the first thing that we see here is the confidence of God's presence. As we begin to read this, even though they were surrounded by an enemy that was extremely brutal, that had the ability and the power to not just conquer them, but to literally obliterate them, the psalmist reminded the people of God's presence in their lives, and he was calling them to have confidence in this great presence of God. And so it begins this way in verse number 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Now notice the tense of the verb in this verse. He said it's a present tense. It's not that God was as if it was a day that had passed. It's not future tense that God will be as if it was a day that is yet to come, but this was actually in their present tense. God is. He is today present in your present. And notice the three things that he says he is. God is our refuge. He's our shelter. He's our fortress. He is our strength. He is the one who is the pathway to spiritual victory and to have the strength that is required in our lives. And thirdly, he says he's not just our refuge and strength, he is a very present help. Now, the Hebrew words that were used there in the original psalm are extremely meaningful. Very, of course, means, guess what? Very, or much, or abundance. But that word present is written in such a way that it's the idea of experience. That God's presence at this moment is not something that can be explained. It's something that can only be experienced. I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, but I've been to Niagara Falls a few times, and I could stand here and I could try, if you've never been there, I could try to explain Niagara Falls to you. But I cannot explain it to you. Niagara Falls is something you actually have to experience, because it's then that you can take in the majesty of God's creation at that moment. And that's the idea here, is that God is our refuge and our strength. He is that presence in our lives that cannot really be explained, but can only be experienced in that time of trouble. And the word trouble means to be in a tight space, which was very appropriate for the people who were in Jerusalem, because the Assyrian army was laying siege to the city, and they were just squeezing and moving in, and they were in a tight place. And listen, you may be today in a tight place. You may not be in Jerusalem surrounded by Assyrians who are going to rip your lips off, but I can almost guarantee that you've been in tight places professionally. Maybe you're in a tight place relationally. Maybe you're in a tight place ethically or morally. Maybe a tight place physically. So what does that mean? That he is a ever-present help in trouble when your world is in chaos, when your marriage is dissolving, when your children are not functioning the way that you had hoped or dreamed that they would, or when things start to get tight financially for you, or when your job seems to be hanging in the balance. What does that mean? It means that God is exactly what you need when you need it. He is a very present help in time of trouble. He is the refuge. He is the strength. He is that help that can only be experienced in that moment. He is what you need exactly when you need it. Think about that. He is the peace when your life is in chaos. He is our righteousness when we have sinned. He is the light when the path in our life seems to grow dark and dim. He is the strength when we feel weak. He is a very present help in trouble. And this is the confidence that the psalmist had as he was thinking about being surrounded by these enemies of God and the enemy of God's people. And he said, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And then in verse 2, it starts with one of my favorite words in the Bible, therefore. Now we have to stop and say what the therefore is there for. And the therefore refers back to verse 1. He says, because God is my refuge, because God is my strength, because God is exactly what I need when I need him in my times of trouble. For that reason, look what he says. We will not fear, though the earth should change. Turn too many pages there. And though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. Listen, the psalmist is saying, the circumstances may never change. The circumstances may not get better. And actually, the circumstances may actually get worse. But he said, I will not fear. I will not be overwhelmed by anxiety. He is making a conscious choice to rebuke the fear and the anxiety in his life. And he's not doing it by sheer willpower. He's doing it because he's confident in the fact that God is present in his presence. Therefore, we will not fear, even though all these calamities may happen. He said, we will not fear. And then, verse 2, probably in your Bible, ends with a word, maybe over into the margin a little bit. It's the word Selah, S-E-L-A-H. It was a musical term that was used in the early centuries, and you'll find it several times throughout the book of Psalms. But it's a Hebrew word that means to pause or to break, or it's an interlude. It was designed in such a way that the people who would sing this song, that when they got to that moment, they were to pause. They were to catch their breath. They were to stop and contemplate on what the words were that they had just finished singing. How many times do we sing songs and we don't even really think about the words that we're singing? How many times have we recited things and we recite them and we don't even really contemplate the words that we're saying? And here, this is designed to get the people who are singing this song to say, all right, stop, catch your breath. Just think about that for a second. Our God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, no matter what the circumstances of life tell us. Stop and think and pause and consider that God is present in your present. The song goes on, and next it talks about the comfort of God's presence. That there is great comfort in knowing that God is present in our presence. I remember when I was in 8th grade, there were a group of boys, I still remember their names, Brian, Bill, and Charlie. I still remember their names. And for some reason, as lovable and as kind and as likable as I am, they didn't like me. And so they always wanted to beat me up. And so every time I'd be walking through the hallway between classes, like I had to look over my shoulder to make sure one of those guys wasn't behind me and ready to attack me. But there were times that I had great comfort as I was walking down the hallway. And that was when my brother, who was the biggest kid in our entire class, when he was walking beside me, I didn't have to fear. I didn't have to look over my shoulder to wonder where those guys were at because I knew my brother was beside me. And that's the same idea that we're going to see here next in Psalm 46, that the psalmist reminds believers that there's great comfort in knowing that God is present in our presence. In verse number 4, it tells us, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. Now, the description here is the city of Jerusalem. It was God's city. In the middle of the city of Jerusalem was the temple, which was a physical representation of God's presence among his people. And here the psalmist is reminding the people that this place is the dwelling place of God. We are God's people. He is in the midst of us. And even though we're surrounded by enemies who are seeking to annihilate us, there's great comfort in knowing that God is present. But then he goes on, and he wrote in verse 6, the nations made an uproar, the kingdoms tottered. He raised his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Though the nations may clash with one another and governments may rise and fall, he said, it doesn't matter what's going on out around us because the Lord of hosts is with us. He is what we need exactly when we need him, and he is our stronghold. He is the one who is present with us and strengthens us and comforts us no matter what chaos is going on around us. But there's comfort in knowing that God is present in your present. And then he used that word again, Selah. Just stop for a moment and think. Catch your breath. Consider that for a moment. That God is present in your present. Then the psalm goes on and addresses the calm of God's presence. That there is this calm that happens, that it's to calm our, not just to comfort our heart, but bring calm to our heart that is ever seeking to be filled with anxiety and fear and worry. And so in verse 8 it says, come, behold the works of the Lord. Now, again, the psalmist stops here. He says, this isn't something I can explain to you. This is something that you just have to come and see and experience. Come and behold the works of the Lord. What are those works? Who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. He said, I want you to come and see this. Because no longer is he talking about a city that is under siege. He is now talking about the calm of the battlefield over a defeated enemy. He said, I want you to go out onto the battlefield and look at the dead and the debris, the dust that has covered the broken bow and the splintered spear. Look at the chariots that are turned over on their sides and maybe still smoldering from being set on fire. Because God has been victorious, there is this calm that you and I can experience when God is present in our presence. So, because all of that is true, what should you and I do? Now, before I get to my application, I just want to share with you historically what happened when Psalm 46 was written. I told you how this brutal army of the Assyrians, 185,000 soldiers, had the city surrounded. There was no escape. The people of Jerusalem, they may have been running out of food. They were maybe running out of hope. And there was no place where they could run. King Hezekiah, the king of the Jews at this point, he prayed. And he asked God to intervene in a special way. And you can read about this in 2 Kings 19. What happened that night was one angel, not 1,000 angels, one angel went out that night and slaughtered all 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Sennacherib left and went back to Nineveh. One angel, through one prayer, got rid of the entire Assyrian army. Now, when you think about that, let me ask you, what did the people in Jerusalem do? Nothing. Zip, zilch, nada. Nothing. And so when you understand what happened in the context of the writing of Psalm 46, the application that the psalmist gives here, this psalm ends like it's been going through with declarative statement after declarative statement after declarative statement. This is who God is. He's present in our presence. And then this psalm ends with a command to the people. And it's the command of the presence of God. And this is what the command tells us to do. This is the application that the psalmist himself, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, gave to believers. Look at what it says. It says to those of us who believe, cease striving and know that I am God. It's a command. Cease striving. The Hebrew word there means to relax or to let go or to allow something to fall. Cease striving and know that I am God. The problem is, if you're like me, we don't like the whole idea of cease striving, right? Because when I cease striving, when I let go, it means that I can't be in control. It means that I can't fix it. I can't offer my opinion. I can't be the center of attention. I can't be the main character in the story when I cease striving. And that's why sometimes it's so hard for us. But if God is present in your present, you need to understand that there are circumstances, there are seasons, there are situations in my life, in your life, in which there is nothing our striving will do to fix the situation or the circumstance or the season of life that you find yourself in. And so there's times that we need to cease striving. We need to chill out. We need to relax. We need to chillax. I don't know if that's even a term anymore, but when I was a kid, we used to say that, chillax, okay? Just chill out. Cease striving. And there's a second part to it, and know that I am God. It doesn't say cease striving and hope that I am God. It doesn't say cease striving and think that I am God. Cease striving and know that I am God. And that word know is, again, the idea of knowing through experience. It's not a knowledge that's gained from lectures. It's not a knowledge that's gained from sermons. It's not a knowledge that's gained from from friends who tell us their stories. It's a knowledge that's only obtained through the experiences of life. And so he says, cease striving, let go, relax, chill out, and know from experience that I am God. The God who's big enough to control all the events of history is the one who cares about every event that's going on in my life. Cease striving and know that I am God. I can almost guarantee there's some of you here this morning, you need to cease your worrying and know that he is God. Some of you need to cease your fear and know that he is God. Some of you need to cease striving and know that he is God. Let go of the anger, let go of the bitterness, let go of the worry, let go of all those things that you're striving with, and know that he is God, because he goes on, cease striving and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The God who's big enough, who's going to receive all the glory and the honor and the praise of all creation, is the one who cares for each and every one of us, because in verse 11 it ends this way: the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Selah. Pause. Take a breath. Reflect. And cease striving. And know that he is God. God is present in your presence. So cease striving. And you will be glad that you did. I want to give you some homework this week. And your homework is just simply this. I want you to think about all the things that may be going on in your life that you realize right now are beyond your control. There's nothing you can do to fix it. There's nothing you can do to make it better. There's nothing you can do to change the circumstances. And I want you to begin to list those things. Okay? However long the list has to be. It may, for some of you, it may only be a couple things. For some of you, it may be a couple pages front and back. But just list every single one of them as they come to your mind. And then every day, I want you to read the first thing that's on your list, whatever it is. That one thing that's beyond your control. Just read it out loud. And after you read that out loud, I want you to take Psalm 46 and read it out loud right after that. And cease striving. And know that he is God, because he is present in your presence. Even though there's things that may never change, he is present in your presence. In 1521, Martin Luther, as he began the Protestant Reformation, there was a declaration made about Martin Luther, and it said that he needed to be apprehended and punished for the heretic that he is. And so everyone at that moment was looking for Martin Luther. One day he was on his way walking home when a masked man on a horse put a sack over Martin Luther's head, put him on a horse, and took him hostage. But he wasn't taken to the authorities. He was taken to the only man in the world at that time who could protect him, Frederick III. And he was taken to Frederick's castle, which is on a steep cliff. And there he protected Martin Luther. And it was at that time that Martin Luther took the Greek New Testament and translated it into the German language so that everyday people could actually read the Bible. And it began this wildfire that became the Protestant Reformation. And I can only imagine that while he was in this castle, that he may have read Psalm 46. And he was reminded of the great fortress that he was in. He was reminded of the strong men that were there to protect him. But I don't think Martin Luther found his solace in the castle or the men who were surrounding him. He found his solace in the God of Psalm 46. And we're not really sure, but it may have been at that time that Martin Luther penned the words to the famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." a bulwark never failing. So as we end our service today, we're actually going to end by singing Martin Luther's famous hymn from 500 years ago. So I'm going to ask the singers to come back up here and lead us in the song. I'm going to ask you to